Previously, Dr. Huff led the Office of Nuclear Energy as the Assistant Secretary. Before joining the Department of Energy, she was a professor in nuclear, plasma, and radiological engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she currently and previously also led the Advanced Reactors and Fuel Cycles Research Group. Fun fact, a few years ago, Katy had a lightning talk at SciPy about how she built her wedding website. It's an icon for the ages. So any of you who want to dig that up, it's a great lightning talk, very fun. And again, I just want to remind everybody that the keynote questions will be, you submit them in the keynote channel on Slack, and then we will read them out loud after Dr. Huff's plenary.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Monk. Wow. This room contains some of the brightest minds that I have ever had the opportunity to work with. I want you to know that I have the greatest respect and joy to be here for sort of this room. It's really like old home week, you know, in the last 30 minutes that I've been in this building, I've had some nostalgia. There's someone here who's known me since I was like 13. I've had some, optimism, which I think is sorely needed. I've discussed text editor preferences. All of these are the things that I look forward to when going to SciPy, and I'm really looking forward to being truly present here with you all for the coming days, and I'm extremely grateful to the organizing committee for making that possible for me, so thank you for having me here. However, I should admit to you, I'm a bit distracted. It will be a challenge to be present here with you. In fact, I'm somewhat troubled. We'll get to that, though. That will be a large fraction of this talk as my sort of general topics of distraction. But let me do a little bit of introducing beyond Professor Monk's extremely kind introduction. I'll give you an idea of who I am, where SciPy has played a role in my life, and what I've been up to for the last few years when I have been not here at SciPy every year, which I miss so dearly. Okay, so I am a nuclear engineering professor, and just so we're all on the same page, I'm going to share with you 3 slides that explain pretty much everything in nuclear engineering. So it's super simple. Basically, a neutron, that's the white one, it's neutral, so it's white, and it strikes an isotope. In this case, it's just the nucleus that we care about, so we're not even showing you the electrons. In this case, it's an isotope of uranium, lots of neutrons and protons. They're positive, so they're red for some reason in almost everyone's diagrams. It strikes this atom, briefly becomes quite excited, and then splits. That fission causes a burst of energy and extra neutrons to come off of the remaining 2 fission products. Those neutrons then go on to create more fissions. That fission chain reaction is what drives nuclear reactors. If you put enough uranium atoms together in the fuel and you make sure the neutrons are the right energy and you make sure everything is having exactly the same number of neutrons per generation as the generation before, then you have a critical sustained nuclear reactor. You put that nuclear reactor in the red part of this diagram. It creates heat. The heat goes out of the reactor into a heat exchanger. The heat exchanger makes steam. The steam turns the turbine, and you get electricity going to, it appears, frankly, Seattle. So that's it. That's nuclear engineering. I am not really going to talk about nuclear engineering or really even my programming at all in this talk. I'm going to talk about everything else that I've been up to for the last few years. But I do just want everyone to feel like they've had a little taste of nuclear engineering. If you want more, my Professor Monk and I have a student here who's talking in like about an hour and a half, I think, Oleg Yarda, so you can learn all about nuclear engineering from Oleg. All right, so now that we're all nuclear engineers, I'll sort of talk about how I got to be one and what role SciPy had in my life, and then I'll sort of talk a little bit about this distraction I mentioned. So I grew up in Texas. I learned a lot of science. I got a physics degree at the University of Chicago. I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison and got a Ph.D. in nuclear engineering. I did my postdoc at UC Berkeley, where I was lucky to be part of the Berkeley Institute for Data Science. I was one of the first postdoc in the cohort there, and it made a huge difference in my life. And then I was a professor at the University of Illinois. Throughout this time, Python had a huge role. My very first SciPy conference, I was like part of the programming committee because it was so welcome. There was just so much desire to have people volunteer that I jumped in and helped to organize because I'd known a lot of you folks for a little while, and I had an opportunity to work with the SciPy conference in the early days. I helped to start a club about scientific computing called The Hacker Within. I helped to put the paperwork together to make the Software Carpentry Foundation work. I taught one of the first software carpentry workshops here at SciPy. I helped with data carpentry. I helped with JOS, of course, though I've been a little absent from all of these things for a while. As I mentioned, BIDS played a huge role for me in the sort of 2016 timeframe. All of those other things were sort of slightly before then. I wrote a book called Effective Computation in Physics with Anthony Skopatz, who is just an incredible person and has just had babies, so I hope he's not here, but if he is, please. Okay, I didn't think so. He has little baby twins, so congratulations to Anthony. And various other things on the practice of reproducible research. So that's where a lot of my sort of training came from, was these organizations that I had the opportunity to be a part of made me better at the things I would do in my career, namely teaching and engagement and creating community. Here's an example of that community. Some of you will recognize folks from this SciPy community, including various Matts and Anthony Skopatz and a handful of other folks. An interesting fact is that one of the SciPy conferences that I went to, I think the first one, there were actually more people called Matt than women registered to attend the meeting. I know that because we did the analysis on who registered, and I think it's gotten way better. So thank you for fixing that. Here's a picture of me doing some of those software carpentry workshops in the early days here at SciPy when it was raging hot in Austin. So I'm in like a tank top in the conference room. You can tell. These are those women that almost outnumbered the Matts, but not quite, from that conference. It was only another year before the women at the meeting started to grow, and so this is sort of a year or two later. We had a sort of women's BOF at lunch. That was really delightful. I started growing up, and software carpentry was growing up, and SciPy was also growing up, so I put on a blazer. And SciPy just grew and grew and grew, and it started to look a lot more like this size of a meeting. And I learned just an incredible amount going to SciPy year after year after year. So for all of you who were part of that, thank you. And I think the only thing I've really done in seriousness to give back to SciPy in a real way was I had the opportunity, after writing that book, to give a keynote at PyCon, which was in 2017. And still, I've met presidents, I've engaged with multiple high-level officials, I've had huge diplomatic events, I've been to COP, it remains the biggest talk that I've ever given. And perhaps the most important because, my message at the time was that all these people at PyCon had all of the skills they needed to help SciPy. The whole point of that talk was that there was this resource sitting in the room. 3,000 people were at PyCon that year. It was crazy. I was absolutely terrified, absolutely terrified. The room was enormous. And the whole thesis was, first of all, soon you'll see Jake Vanderplas, who's going to give an even cooler talk. And I would like all of you to contribute to scientific Python code. Many of the people at PyCon have technical degrees, undergraduate degrees in biology and astrophysics and things like that, but of course went to the private sector after those degrees. But many of them had 20% time from Google. They had the opportunity to spend a little time giving back to like NumPy and Pandas, and we were facing a real software maintainability crisis. I expect that not 100% of that has changed, but I think a part of what is changing is that there has been a little bit more drumming on the drum of reminding folks that use these tools in industry that they have to give back. And so you see companies like NVIDIA and such sort of really giving back in this way. And my hope was that individuals in that conference would do the same, would take a little extra time and try to explore the science that they remembered loving, maybe from their undergraduate degree, and go find a repository. Maybe it's BioPython or SciPy or AstroPy or a nuclear engineering repository like PERC or Pine, and fix a bug that those scientists are struggling with. Because scientists make up a lot of the majority of the scientific Python universe, and we, are mostly scientists in many cases and not, fundamentally as programmy as many of those folks had become. Now, many of us have evolved into more programming and less science, but arguably, it sort of takes a village, and some of those villagers have gone off to the private sector and we're giving back. So that was the point of that talk. The reason I bring it up is that I have a very similar theme here today, slightly different for you all, because you're already doing that, right? You are the core, the backbone, the guardians of transparency and openness in science. I don't need to tell you all of that. I have a slightly different message, but in parallel. So anyway, all of that work sort of taught me to be a better teacher. It taught me to be a better speaker. I owe an incredible amount of my ability to teach to the scientific Python community. I owe a lot of my ability to do research at all to the scientific Python community. Many of the coolest plots that come out of my group use familiar color maps because they're using familiar libraries. They are absolutely super reliant on Python. When I do nuclear research with my students, like Oleg, we rely heavily on Python. We write a lot of code in C++. There's even a lot of code in nuclear engineering and Fortran, but Python is our sort of interface to a lot of that work. All right, so I talked a lot about how I got to become a nuclear engineering professor and what role SciPy had to do with all of that. I had mentors here. I had students in this community. Lorena Barba was a huge influence on me. What a delight to see her here. And I was a happy professor. I'd been a professor for 5 years at the University of Illinois, and I was submitting my tenure packet, and everything was going super well. I had funding, I had students, we had research, we were really kicking butt. And I got an email in the night from someone who said, I want to talk to you, it was February of 2021, said, I want to talk to you about leadership in the Department of Energy. And I thought, ha, finally, I'm important enough that they're going to ask me who I think should run the Office of Nuclear Energy. And so I spent all night writing up a list of 10 people who would best serve President Biden in the Office of Nuclear Energy as the Assistant Secretary, someone nuclear engineers call NE1, Nuclear Energy 1. The top official in the government is a Senate-confirmed official who decides sort of how to spend $1 to $2 billion every year on research and development in nuclear engineering. So it was a pretty important job. I thought really hard about it, put together a list, and the next morning, get on the phone with this guy. He turns out to be the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Secretary of Energy. And I said, I have your list for you. And he said, what list? Like, we were gonna see if you would interview? Like, you're the list. So no greater shock has ever been experienced in the world. And I joined the Department of Energy. I spent about a year as the second in command, acting as the first in command, and then was eventually confirmed by the Senate, and spent 2 more years as the official assistant secretary running that office. I had never before to anyone expressed any ambition to be in the government. It had never even occurred to me that I should ever have such an ambition. And I had been perfectly happy writing software with my students, doing nuclear engineering at the University of Illinois, but it was a real honor, and it gave me a lot of perspective on what a person can do with the skills that we have. And a lot of those are data analysis and like demanding transparency and asking for reproducibility and double checking everyone's work, not just reading graphs and plots, which comes from every scientist. And so I had a great time. I met dignitaries. I really pushed forward a number of agenda items around uranium, and Russia invaded Ukraine while I was there, and so there were a lot of emergencies. They invaded Ukraine by walking through Chernobyl. Then they proceeded to take over the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, which they continue to have control over. And so we had a lot to do. But I think the thing that helped was that I was able to do something about it. I had some agency to change the direction of things that were going. I had some agency to fix stuff, which was new. Usually I was on the outside looking into government, and it was a really exciting opportunity. And I have to tell you, it was very fulfilling. And I learned that a lot of public service officials, a lot of public servants in the civil sector have this kind of same sense of service to the community that I had first seen in the free and open source software community. Public servants are very, very similar to free and open source software developers. In fact, some of them are the same. How many of you in this audience are both? Okay, I got a couple little hands here, right? Public sector folks are probably not mostly at this meeting as they usually would be because of a federal constraint on travel, but it's a very similar general feeling of commitment to the public. And I bring it up because having left, I was a political appointee. So once term ends with the president, I left a little early so I could match the academic year. But I'm no longer in that position to be able to do much from within. I now am again looking in from the outside. And there are plenty of things that are going on in this administration that wouldn't have happened in the last administration. And I'm not going to get partisan here, but anyone sort of looking out at the world may have some feelings about whether it's going well or not. And you may also, like me, find it hard to be present with your work and with what you care about in your day-to-day lives, even with your family, if you're concerned about whether you're doing enough to advance our society, given what's going on in the world. So that's the challenge of being present with you today. And so I thought I'd tell two brief stories and then give you a solution that I'm going to start working towards personally, and maybe you all will work towards along with me. So first, I want to tell you a story about Russia walking into Ukraine. When the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started, the Russian forces did their invasion sort of starting at Chernobyl. This involved a great deal of concern about radiological incidents, and the first emergency operations center that got stood up with regard to all of that in the middle of the night was in the Department of Energy, where atomic energy work happens. The National Nuclear Security Administration has this room and a few others just like it, where they observe what is happening in an emergency situation involving usually something nuclear. This room and the ones like it adjacent to it stands ready all the time, but sometimes they go on full bore mode, right? That's not what they call it, but that's what it feels like. They go on full 24-hour operations, and they are stood up, is how they say it. And so I got called into this room. This happened with Zaporizhia as well, sort of shortly thereafter. And it's important that you all know that familiar plots and color maps and data tools are used to figure out what's going on in the world, even in the Department of Energy's Emergency Ops Center. I know this because an emergency was going on. I had been called by a robotic voice that I must report to DOE. I had just gotten home. It was like 7:30 p.m. and I turned right around. Thankfully, I only lived 2 blocks from DOE at that time. And I get there. I cannot find the ops center. I finally get in there. I'm a mess. My hair's everywhere. I'm sweaty. I've been running all over DOE because I'd never been required to go to this room before. And I get there and this guy goes, "You're Kathryn Huff!" And I was like, I'm in charge of NE. What do you need to tell me? And he was like, "I saw your SciPy talk." And so I want you to know that the people in this room are so much like you. And they are writing code, and they are doing data, and they absolutely rely on everything you do. So if you just continue doing exactly what you are doing, developing NumPy, fixing a bug in Matplotlib, you will be helping these people. They may never get to see you because they live in a tiny windowless basement worrying about emergencies, but if you ever do enter that room, they might recognize you just from your work here. So, 1, you're probably doing enough. That's the moral of the first story. The moral of the second story is, if it feels like you're not doing enough, there might be something we can do. And here's an example. One of the big projects we worked on in great detail at DOE was to try to figure out if it was even possible to get to net zero by 2050, what it would take. The premise was, we get to net zero by 2050, work backwards. How much wind, solar, batteries, nuclear, geothermal, hydrogen do we have to deploy? How quickly do we have the supply chains to do it, et cetera? And so we called these, with the Loan Programs Office, the liftoff reports, like liftoff to commercialization for each of these energy systems. They were huge, huge endeavors, extremely useful reports. And in April of this year, they disappeared from the internet. You still get a 404 on the liftoff.energy.gov page. There are pages referring to these reports on other parts of the Loan Programs Office page, but you cannot get to them from DOE. This is true for lots of data sets across the government right now, and regardless of how you feel about it, I was mad, all right, because this was really important work that we had worked really hard on. But don't worry, you guys know this. We have the Internet Archive. And so the Wayback Machine had preserved it, right? And so you can just go right back and find those PDFs and boom. It doesn't matter what the government decides to delete, we still have that history. And so I committed in April to start figuring out what I could do for the Internet Archive. I have yet to do anything truly useful, but I have downloaded some repos for the Wayback Machine, some of which are in Python, to see if I can fix any of their bugs. And I have committed that in the next year, I am gonna make a pull request to the Internet Archive. It's a tiny thing, a teeny tiny thing. They have tons of repositories. They're fixing bugs every day. They've got developers around the world. They don't need me. But boy, am I gonna feel a little better that I get back to an institution that absolutely saved my butt, because I had learned to really rely on these reports. And I think any future government that sort of retakes that mantle of getting to net zero by 2050 will also rely on those reports. All right, so what do I want to say to you? Well, I want to say that that's not the only thing out there. You don't have to contribute to the Internet Archive, and maybe a lot of you already are, and you don't have this feeling that I have that, like, maybe I'm not doing enough just by doing my science. There are lots of great organizations that literally run the government, and since we may be facing a time very soon where there are very few people running the government, perhaps people that used to maintain these repositories, this could be an opportunity for you to support the endeavors in our government, local, state, federal, that make things go. Many of you contributed to CDC repositories during COVID. CDC has over 400 repositories, and over 70 of them are in Python. So if you're worried about CDC things, you can help. The US Geological Survey, many of you do work at the national labs or in contractor companies for the US Geological Survey. They have 157 repositories and 35 in Python, and they're facing cuts in the upcoming budget. The US Environmental Protection Agency also facing significant cuts, not just in budget, but in staffing. Over 600 repositories, over 100 in Python, right? The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, maybe you're worried about them. not sure why you might be, but 216 repositories, 19 in Python. You're getting the idea. Maybe you're worried about veterans, right? Maybe there's some concern that some of the folks who left the government were making really important contributions to the Veterans Affairs Agency. The Department of Veterans Affairs has hundreds of repositories and dozens in Python. The U.S. General Services Administration gets a little deep state, but you should know that this is one of the most important agencies in the U.S. federal government. It says how one can buy stuff, hire people, and run things. And it has over 1,000 repositories and hundreds in Python, and most of them are not doing science, but there is a lot of NumPy in there. There's plenty of pandas. You can find something useful that you can do if you care about things continuing to move along in a universe where maybe many of these maintainers are gone. General Services Administration also has a secondary GitHub repo, which has another few thousand repositories and more in hundreds of Python. And this part, 18F, is a part of the General Services Administration that's entirely focused on openness in government. Like human interfaces with the government basically all fall under 18F. If you care about parks and the National Park Service and hiking and stuff, they have repositories. One of them is really cool. It's for acoustic signal assessment. So I don't know, I might actually see if I can be helpful with that one because I'm pretty sure they're using it for birdsong or something. Anyway, you get the idea. The Federal Election Commission, there was an executive order suggesting that they should not be independent. Like any regulatory agency in the government that does any regulation, ideally it's an independent agency, and one of the executive orders this year indicates that none of them should have any independence from the White House. So if that sort of thing concerns you, 15 Python repositories. I don't want to get too political, but we all eat. If you care about the Food and Drug Administration, 17 Python repositories. It goes on and on. Weather.gov, for reasons I think we all know, I looked to see what they were up to this week, and unfortunately they only have 2 repositories. Neither are in Python, and there's only, it seems, 1 developer. So maybe we can help. All right, I know this community is doing everything in the universe of science, and in a moment where science maybe doesn't have the acknowledgement at the highest levels that it has earned and deserves, perhaps just continuing to do science is enough. And you should feel that it is the case. Recall story number 1, right? But if you want to do more, it's very simple. I suggest you just consider GitHub organizations for the kind of entities that you're worried might fall apart. And at federal and state and local levels, you can browse those repos, review the issues, and do what you do best. I really assure you that if you can use SciPy, you can fix issues in SciPy, whether it's actually SciPy or it's the sort of scientific Python packages surrounding it. This is what the whole point of the sprints, and if you don't believe this sentence, go to the sprints at the end of this conference. And if you can repair bugs in SciPy, which you'll learn at the sprints if you don't already do it, I think you can repair bugs in the world. Thank you. I've left plenty of time for questions, so if you're on the Slack, maybe ask them. I didn't sign on to the Slack, so I can't ask myself a question.
Sorry, I can grab the mics from you.
Oh, there's floating mics.
Yes, I'll be back.
Great. Any questions, ideas, thoughts, concerns? Is anyone mad that I was too political? I want to just say the following. I recognize that SciPy is not a place for partisan political campaigns, and that was not my intent here. However, I do think SciPy has always recognized the linkage between the technological work we do and its impact on society. And so I really hope that you took it in that frame, and if not, I'm very happy to engage with you anyway. Okay. Oh, we've got one back here.
So we are going to direct people to ask the questions in Slack, and then we will read them. And we have one from Jake W. of what do you think about the future of nuclear energy in the U.S.?
Heck. So what do I think about the future of nuclear energy in the U.S.? I think it's on reasonable footing and faces the same challenges that it has faced for a very long time, which is nuclear energy is going to have to build reactors quickly and at a reliable, consistent price. At the moment, there's a lot more support for nuclear energy on both sides of the aisle, as evidenced by the fact that my Senate confirmation vote was extremely bipartisan. It was like 81-9 or something, or I don't remember, 81-11. I think a bunch of people didn't vote, but I even got Bernie Sanders, who I love, but I wasn't sure he would love nuclear energy enough to vote yes on me. The bipartisanship in nuclear comes from the recognition that we need nuclear energy to solve the climate crisis, and the recognition that nuclear energy provides a resilient, stable source of energy. And so, different parts of the aisle value energy security and resilience versus the climate differently, right? I come more on the climate side myself, but that bipartisanship comes from its sort of multifaceted nature. Whether reactors are built cheaply and on a time will determine how many we build.
We have a question from Carol Willing.
Carol.
So Carol brings up, the NASA TOPS program used to be an organization on GitHub and it was wiped out. And so Carol wants to know, what if those government repos you just showed are wiped clean? What happened with the NASA TOPS repos?
What a great question. And of course, it's from Carol Willing, who I should have mentioned before was also one of those mentors that sort of helped me become a better SciPy person. So I think this is a great opportunity for what we used to call, probably still call, a hostile fork. You can upload everything back onto the internet with its same files, and you yourself can be the GitHub archive if you really, really want to, but it starts with downloading the stuff cloning all those repos today. So one thing that you can do that takes absolutely no interaction with any of these people on these government GitHub organizations is just fork and clone the entire org today. If you do that and you're worried that the organization's going to fall apart, you've already done something, because if it does and it gets wiped, which I do expect may happen to other organizations, you could upload a hostile fork. The legality of that, you have to make your own choices, but my understanding is that if it was licensed originally open source, you can usually upload it right back.
Okay, Emma Bishop has a nuclear question for you. So what do you think about private tech companies building nuclear power plants to power AI data centers?
What do I think about private companies buying nuclear power plants to power data centers? I have a confession to make. In addition to being a full-time professor, I have a little side gig with a really large company, with AWS, in which I try to guide them in some of their decisions around how to power data centers. This is another reason why I sometimes feel like I need to give back a little more. But the reason that I agreed to it, with some internal kind of wrangling, is that they are going to build these data centers, whether it's clean energy supporting them or not. And Amazon is extremely committed to its climate pledges. Because I felt that these two things were true, I felt like at minimum they should make the right choices about which reactors to work with. Something that I think a lot of folks are grappling with, that I myself am grappling with, is whether or not such entities should be pulling power off the grid in a way that destabilizes the rest of it. I think it makes a lot of sense to do one thing that Amazon, for example, is doing, which is to buy power ahead of time for new capacity that's dedicated to them. They have also made some procurements of power that's already on the grid at a premium, which I think is sort of arguably is a little harder to defend, and in fact created this kind of complicated FERC situation, which has now been resolved with the Talon deal. Without going into great detail about that, what I'll say is I think buying new capacity is what they need to do, and it can have the sort of side effect of reducing the cost for the nth of a kind reactor. So in Amazon's case, they're buying X energy power that does not yet exist from reactor company that hasn't built a reactor yet. They have put actual money into that company to make sure that they succeed, to get them through that valley of death for innovation so that they can start building at scale. If they do that, then those reactors will be available with less input monetarily from the government than they otherwise would have required. I think that's worth fighting for, but is it a delicate ethical universe? Absolutely.
I'm going to direct people in Slack to like the comments you want, the questions that you want to be asked, and that will be how we rank them and move forward, since we have a lot of questions coming in, which is great. Matthew Fikert has a question for you. So you mentioned on your slides about the Emergency Response Center and how they recognized you from SciPy. So from your experience in government, do you find that there's people in government organizations that are opening up issues in scientific Python GitHub repositories, like outside of orgs? Or are they users that are benefiting from the community but aren't necessarily being vocal about their needs online?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely a lot of that where like many government workers feel like the sort of requirement of protecting government data and information and agendas can restrict them from being able to publicly declare that they found a bug in some repository, right? I think some of that is personality based. Some individuals are more willing to sort of not worry about that and sort of see the big picture and maybe, put issues on a website about their sort of internal government challenges, running into a bug, doing a particular thing. And some of them may even use some of their government time to contribute back to repositories. The existence of many of these GitHub organizations is an indication that general counsel at many agencies has enabled some level of this. So if the lawyers say it's okay, there is a defensible argument that folks should be free to be doing this. But there will always be a little bit of concern in the government as they sort of put things out. There's this sort of cultural concern often that like there are security issues or something like that associated with sort of reaching out into the universe. I think it's getting better, and there certainly are individuals on all of these organizations that are fighting for like a lot more openness and transparency. Are they there yet? No, I think they're sort of constrained by institutional lag in a lot of cases. I don't know if that really answers it, but yeah.
Okay, so Brigitte asked a question about the repos that you were sort of directing us to maybe contribute to. And so how can you identify if a repo is open for external contributions, as we can't just assume that there's enough bandwidth to shepherd and review these contributions by the few people who are still in their roles in these agencies?
Such a good question. It is really hard to tell who has left the federal government, and based on their pull requests, it's almost impossible to tell because many of them may leave the federal government and then go start working for a contractor that does a very similar thing and now are just paid by a different person to do it. In the current environment, you'll have to do some sleuthing. I think the best way to tell whether a repo is accepting new pull requests is the same way you would tell in any other scientific Python repository, which is in the README or in the main sort of discussion pages or in the GitHub issues themselves. But one important flag that you might just keep an eye on is that a number of government repositories are labeled as public archive because they are intentionally sort of released every once in a while, but developed internally. And so it's sort of pointless to work on those unless you eventually get the sort of maintainers to open it up a little more seriously. So some of those, and I've got one here, right? So this application that sort of does regulation searches for the Federal Elections Commission's work, that's a public archive. They're not like accepting pull requests to that. Great question.
Okay, Charith asks, what are your thoughts? This is a licensing question. We know you're going to love this. What are your thoughts on open source licenses that restrict use by DoD and other military organizations?
Right. What are my thoughts on restrictive open source licenses that sort of keep stuff out of DoD, for example, use? I think that is smart. If you want to be careful with where your intellectual property goes and your life contribution go, and you are ethically against whatever the Department of Defense is doing. Not only is it your right, but I think it's smart to put it in language, because actually governments do pay attention to licensed documents. They usually don't ignore them. I think that's what you mean, right? It's like open source projects that, are restricted to peaceful use only. This is actually true for lots of things in the government. There is material, uranium, owned by the US government that is flagged for purely civilian use because it's associated with treaties around peace. Right? A lot of other nuclear material owned by the US government is not flagged for purely civilian use, right? But are there people entirely employed to keeping track to make sure that that civilian use stuff doesn't end up in non-civilian use? Absolutely. They take it very, very seriously. A violation of international law could be at stake. And so I would say if this is something you really care about, do it. Include it in your license.
Okay. Paul Ivanov asks, what's your current favorite text editor and why is it Nano/Pico?
It's obviously Vim, and it will always be Vim. My muscles only do Vim. Yeah, so there you have it. It's important to have opinions on text editors, but no opinion is truly humble.
So Lauren asks, what are some good ways to encourage your students and push academic administrations to support work in open source?
Say it again, the first part.
What are some good ways to encourage your students and push academic administrations to support work in open source?
Great news. My students like open source, and I select them for this purpose. So be a chooser. Be choosy with your students. No, I'm serious. If you need to train people to make sure that they understand how open source can serve them exactly as well as MATLAB, do it, right? Software carpentry and other resources can get people on board and make sure that they understand that everything they want to do can be done in the open. How do you get institutions to care about open source contributions? This comes back to Joss and Jose and various sort of activities to give real recognizable institutional credit, like a digital object identifier and a paper published through peer review to a piece of code. The Journal for Open Source Software, a lot of folks here are deeply involved in it. Raise your hand if you're involved in the Journal for Open Source Software, Joss. Yeah, okay. Lorena's not raising her hand. Amazing. So there's a lot of people involved in this, and it's a journal basically where you do code review in order to get to the place where you get a peer-reviewed journal article out of it. That is countable by an institution as stodgy as a university in the United States and probably elsewhere. And so you can find clever ways to fit the system if you want to. And if those aren't clever enough, I'm sure we can brainstorm. But I think things like JOS and training activities like at the tutorials do a pretty good job. And just picking students that get it.
Okay, I think we're getting close to the end, so this is going to be the last question. Max Grover asks, what's the role of large funding agencies, such as DOE, to maintain and support open science and open source communities? And how do you deal with uncertainty / the unplugging nature of recent policies?
Yeah, I think, a lot of the whole talk was really focused on the latter part of the question. Do what you can to get involved in those GitHub organizations and databases and try to do what matters to you with the skills that you're extremely good at. This is a room full of people that can absolutely help the government. I assure you, they do not have the kinds of skill sets at this density that you have in this room. So, download those repos, download those orgs, clone everything, fork stuff. In terms of what is the role of funding agencies, well, it's about to diminish, in many cases up to 40%. In some cases less, right? If you're in the Department of Defense universe, even in the National Nuclear Security Agency universe, it may not be so bad, but the Office of Nuclear Energy, which purportedly is a huge priority of this administration, is still getting a 27% haircut or something, right? And they're gonna have to function with fewer people. And all of that is going to be extremely challenging for science. Whether you agree with those choices or not, it will be a transition, right? And from my perspective, the defense against sort of the challenges for that is to sort of try to fill some gaps. I think many of you in this room probably think like, well, why should we step up and fill those gaps? It might let folks believe that you can just get away with dropping people, and like, why should my free labor, contribute to, papering over what is really a major flaw in policy? And the answer is, you have to decide for yourself which thing is more important, the principle of the thing or the thing. Thank you.
Okay, let's thank our keynote speaker, Kathryn Huff.